Of all detectable islands, the Neverland is the snuggest and most compact. Not large and sprawly, with tedious distances between one adventure and another, but nicely crammed. When you play at it by day with the chairs and tablecloth, it is not the least alarming, but in the 2 minutes before you go to sleep, it becomes very nearly real. That is why there are nightlights. Occasionally, in her travels through her child's minds, Mrs. Darling found things that she could not understand, and of these quite the most perplexing was the word Peter. She knew of no Peter, and yet he was here and there in John and Michael's minds, while Wendy began to be scrawled all over with him. The name stood out in bolder letters than any of the other words, and as Mrs. Darling gazed, she felt that it had an oddly cocky appearance. "Yes, he is rather cocky," Wendy admitted with regret. Her mother had been questioning her. "But who is he, my pet?" "He is Peter Pan, you know, Mother." At first, Mrs. Darling did not know, but after thinking back into her childhood, she remembered a Peter Pan who was said to live with the fairies. There were old stories about him, as that when children died, he went part of the way with them, so that they should not be frightened. She had believed in him at the time, but now she was married and full of sense, she quite doubted whether there was any such person. "Besides," she said to Wendy, "he would be grown up by this time." "Oh, no, he isn't grown up," Wendy assured her confidently. "And he is just my size." She meant that he was her size in both mind and body. She didn't know how she knew it. She just knew it. Mrs. Darling consulted Mr. Darling, but he smiled pooh-pooh. "Mark my words," he said. "It is some nonsense Nana has been putting in their heads. Just the sort of idea a dog would have. Leave it alone and it will blow over." But it would not blow over, and soon the troublesome boy gave Mrs. Darling quite a shock. Children have the strangest adventures without ever being troubled by them. For instance, they may remember to mention, a week after the event happened, that when they were in the wood they met their dead father and had a game with him. It was in this casual way that Wendy one morning made a disquieting revelation. Some leaves of a tree had been found in the nursery floor, which certainly were not there when the children went to bed, and Mrs. Darling was puzzling over them when Wendy said, with a tolerant smile, "I do believe it's Peter Pan again." "Wendy, whatever do you mean?" "It is so naughty of him not to wipe," Wendy said, sighing. She was a tidy child. She explained in quite a matter-of-fact way that she thought Peter sometimes came to the nursery at night, and sat on the foot of her bed and played on his pipes to her. Unfortunately, she never woke, so she didn't know how she knew. She just knew. "What nonsense you talk, Precious. No one can get into the house without knocking." "I think he comes in by the window," she said. "My love, it is 3 floors up." "Weren't the leaves at the foot of the window, Mother?" It was quite true. The leaves had been found very near the window. Mrs. Darling did not know what to think, for it all seemed so natural to Wendy that you could not dismiss it by saying she had been dreaming. "My child," the mother cried, "why did you not tell me of this before?" "I forgot," said Wendy lightly. She was in a hurry to get to her breakfast. Oh, surely she must have been dreaming. But, on the other hand, there were the leaves. Mrs. Darling examined them carefully. They were skeleton leaves, but she was sure that they did not come from any tree that grew in England. She crawled about the floor, peering at it, with a candle for marks of a strange foot. She rattled the poker up the chimney and tapped the walls. She let down the tape from the window to the pavement, and it was a sheer drop of 30 feet without so much as a sprout to climb up by. Certainly Wendy had been dreaming. But Wendy had not been dreaming. As the very next night showed, the night on which the extraordinary adventure of these children may be said to have begun. On the night we speak of, all the children were once more in bed. It happened to be Nana's evening off, and Mrs. Darling had bathed them and sung to them till one by one they had let go of her hand and slid away into the land of sleep. All were looking so safe and cozy that she smiled at her fears now and sat down tranquilly by the fire to sew. It was something for Michael, who on his birthday was getting into shirts. The fire was warm, however, and the nursery dimly lit by 3 night lights, and presently The sewing lay on Mrs. Darling's lap. Then her head nodded, oh so gracefully. She was asleep. Look at the four of them. Wendy, Michael over there, John here, and Mrs. Darling by the fire. There should have been a fourth nightlight. While she slept, she had a dream. She dreamt that the Neverland had come too near and that a strange boy had broken through from it. He did not alarm her, for she thought she had seen him once before in the faces of many women who have no children. Perhaps he is to be found in the faces of some mothers also. But in her dream, he had rent the film that obscures the Neverland, and she saw Wendy and John and Michael peeping through the gap. The dream by itself would have been a trifle, but while she was dreaming, the window of the nursery blew open and the boy did drop on the floor. He was accompanied by a strange light, no bigger than your fist, which darted about the room like a living thing, and I think it must have been this light that wakened Mrs. Darling. She started up with a cry and saw the boy, and somehow she knew at once that it was Peter Pan. If you or I or Wendy had been there, we should have seen that he was very like Mrs. Darling's kiss. He was a lovely boy, clad in skeleton leaves and the juices that ooze out of the trees, but the most entrancing thing about him was that he had all of his first teeth. When he saw that she was a grown-up, he gnashed the little pearls at her. End of chapter 1.